why don't you? Today when all the headlines full of red lines and bread lines confuse you and the world seems bleak, don't be blue. In Harper's they have a column, very smart and very solemn, that will amuse you. It asks you little questions to give you smart suggestions how you too can reek with chic like the most ultra clique, and they call it Why Don't You? It asks you, why don't you have your ermine muff wired for sound and use it weekends as a concertina? Why don't you give a charity ball for the Princeton Club and raffle off Vera Zorina? Why don't you throw your mother an occasional bone? Why don't you try sleeping alone? Why don't you take the pretty blue check you won at bridge and kite it? Why don't you dip your head in brandy and light it? Why don't you try wearing gold sandals backwards just for the sheer agony of it? Why don't you send last year's negligee to Cecil Beaton? He'd love it. So they want you to try decorating your flat with bundles of hay. Well, they know what they can do with Harper's. Why don't they? Why don't you try going to Elsa Maxwell's parties as yourself for a change? Why don't you try wearing a hat that won't make your husband look strange? Why don't you develop a bright smile by putting an electric bulb behind each tooth? Why don't you give a testimonial dinner for Hitler in a telephone booth? Why don't you get out of town before you come down with a compound case of heebie-jeebies? Why don't you listen to the birds and bees instead of the zerbies and BBs? So they want you to roll up your rugs and cover your floors with broccoli on the first warm day. Well, they know what they can do with Vogue, too. Why don't they? Why don't you have a stag line composed of the ex-husbands of Peggy Hopkins Joyce? Why don't you crossbreed carrier pigeons with parrots so they can deliver messages by voice? Why don't you try throwing Clifton Webb over your left shoulder and making a wish? Why don't you fill your guest finger bowls with invisible tropical fish? Why don't you try opening your eyes in the middle of a kiss? Why don't you cancel your subscriptions to magazines like this? Why don't you tear everything off your hat and stamp on it? Why don't you take out a homestead in Montana and go camp on it? So they want you to promise you'll slap your own face 200 times a day. Well, tell them you'll have none of it. Tell them you're through with their things to do and they can all take their Harpers and love it.